going on, everybody? Welcome to the second installment of my submission for the 2022 Great Guitar Build-Off. In this episode, we're going to tackle some of the major construction elements of the neck. And to start off, I wanted to show you how I cut the scarf joint on the bandsaw. And so the jig that I use here is pretty simple. It's a squared off piece of maple plywood with another piece basically vertically attached to make a 13-degree angle to the fence. Alright, once that was done, I spent a pretty good amount of time here sanding the scarf joint. And so this is a jig that is also constructed with that same 13-degree angle, and it's made out of MDF. So essentially the body of the jig creates a sled where I tape and clamp the neck into it based on the center line of the neck and the center line of the jig itself. And so then I use the second piece of the jig, which is the actual sanding block, to sand the joint even to that specific angle. So while it took some time to kind of dial in this jig, it definitely took some trial and error. It definitely works great, and since the neck is Purple Heart, as you can see, this took a lot longer than other necks that I've made in the past. But overall, it's a good jig and a great arm workout as well. And then from there, I start to prep the glue up by attaching the headstock piece to the neck with 2 screws. And I learned this method from Chris at Highline Guitars. It's definitely a really helpful method just in terms of ensuring that the glue doesn't slide around since the joint is at an angle. The one thing to note is that you do have to make sure that you make the neck length fairly wide in order to make sure that you're just planning ahead so you don't end up with a neck length that's too small and that won't accommodate the screws. After getting some glue in the joint, I made sure that the screws were sticking out of the holes just slightly, and then lined up the screws to kind of index into the holes, which works great. And then from there, it's just a matter of tightening those screws down, kind of cleaning up the excess glue, and also just adding some clamps as well. Typically I avoid wiping glue squeeze out just because it can affect the finish in the end. However, in this situation, none of this surface area is ultimately going to come into play in terms of being visible with finish, since it'll be covered by the fretboard or carved away later. After cleaning up the glue a bit more, I went forward to get the truss rod slot carved with the router table. And for this step, you don't really need a router table, but it's a lot easier with one. I've done a couple different necks without the router table, and it went okay. However, it is a lot easier to do with the router table. Also, doing this now while we still have a square edge just makes things definitely a lot easier. And so first, basically, we need to mark out where the actual truss rod is going to land on the neck's center line. So it isn't absolutely crucial to have the truss rod with you when you do this, but I would definitely recommend that. And then from there, I continued just to mark that end of the truss rod slot all the way around the blank, and then transferred a line onto the router table a little bit later with a pencil and a square, just where the edge of the bit reaches. And so the 2 lines together, once they match up, that shows us where to stop so that we don't cut too far. as I continue to route the truss rod cavity here, I would just encourage you to consider liking and subscribing on the channel. It definitely helps me in terms of growing the channel, so appreciate your support on that. Alright, once the truss rod slot was completed, I took the neck blank over to the bandsaw and essentially rough cut it as closely as I could to the line after drawing the outline of the neck onto the blank with the template. Alright, so once I had the neck blank rough cut on the bandsaw, I went ahead and attached my template back to the neck blank, and essentially we're going to route the outside shape of the neck using a pattern bit. And so you can see here, I'm first working on the main stretches of each side of the neck, and essentially once that's done, we move on to the headstock. Now, routing the headstock, it can be a little bit tricky. It can even be a little bit scary. The key is to make sure that the template is taped very strongly onto the headstock, just so it doesn't slide around on you while you're routing. But other than that, that's essentially the last step. And as you can see, the neck is coming together nicely at this stage. It's starting to really look like a guitar. So we'll continue on with some work on the neck and specifically the fretboard in the next episode. And I'm looking forward to seeing you then.